Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Zeinab Badawi, and it's my great pleasure to be moderating this particular panel. It's also wonderful to be in the beautiful city of Stockholm with the very charming Swedish people you encounter at every corner, and it's very nice to meet new friends as well as reacquaint myself with old friends. So this session is about the role of food. What role does food play in our lives? So I'm hoping that we'll be able to answer this question from different perspectives, from my panel behind me, looking at the cultural sense, the role that food plays in our lives in helping define what we mean by being human, and also the role that food plays in development as well as in health and nutrition. So various manifestations of this question. I hope that after your post-lunch slump, that we'll be able to wake you up a little bit. I'm going to start straight away. Professor Richard Wrangham, you studied zoology at Oxford and Cambridge subsequently, so you really are right, it's come back. Thank you. And then you are now currently a professor at Harvard University. You wrote a recently very acclaimed book called Catching Fire, How Cooking Made Us Human. You want to send us all back into the kitchen, do you? No. So, looking at this question, I'll just say very quickly by way of a preamble. Both you and I, a year ago, visited, separately I hasten to add, a unique tribe in Africa, in Tanzania, in the Rift Valley near Lake Eyasi, near the Ngorongoro crater. And of course, as we know, paleontologists and archaeologists believe that this is the cradle of mankind. It's where human beings originated. And we encountered a tribe that's described as unique in the world, unique because they are the last big hunter-gatherers in the world. There are hunter-gatherer societies elsewhere in the world, but these ones are unique because they're big hunter-gatherers. And they live in the way that humans have lived for more than 99% of our history. So they hold unique and many insights into how we lived during what you might call, I suppose, the Stone Age. And I observed, as you did, Richard, their eating habits. And I found those extremely fascinating because the men hunt and the women are the foragers rather than gatherers. They forage because as well as getting fruits and berries and so on that grow wild, they also will catch, little rodents, mice, and so on. So, having visited, the tribe is called the Hadzabe tribe. What did you take away in terms of the role of food in their lives and what insights it held into our origins?
Okay, I'm going to pick up on just one little aspect, and it's true for every human that we know of. So I study chimpanzees in my day job, and if you go out to make No. Yes, okay, yes. There we go. Thank you. So people who go out to try and make movies about chimpanzees, they want to go out and see them making tools and doing incredibly things with theory of mind and have some kind of cultural behavior. And they get really, really bored because all they do is eat. Chimpanzees, if you do a time and motion study, they're spending about 6 hours a day chewing. So, in our society, we spend less than an hour a day chewing. This does not reply to the meal that you linger over with your loved one or whatever. You might spend a lot of time at the dining table, but the actual amount of time you spend chewing is very, very little. And so from a big perspective of what kind of species are we and what kind of role does food play in our lives, it's fascinating to go not just to America, but all the way to the Hadzabe with a completely different kind of subsistence system, and still the same is true. The evening meal is the critical locus of feeding time, and all sorts of social events that happen around it. But the overall position that I come fascinated by when I think about the role that food has played in our lives is incredibly small. Because it's only less than an hour a day. If we were eating our food raw in the way that chimpanzees do, we would be spending something like 8 hours a day chewing. We have been remarkably freed by this adoption of cooking, evolutionarily. Cooking makes food soft, energy-rich. We don't need to spend so much time on it. So, of course, the problems that we are addressing in this panel and in this whole day about food security and food sustainability don't get affected by that, but nevertheless.
Just very quickly,
we're an old
though,
species.
You say we only spend an hour, but the Hadzabe, I mean, I went out with them hunting and the women foraging. They spend a lot of their day trying to obtain food one way or another. They don't have any refrigeration, obviously, so what they eat, if they catch a big animal, they have to eat very quickly. But you're right, obviously, they did cook and they sat around the table. So obviously our teeth over years our jaws became smaller, our teeth became smaller, and our brains became bigger. But they do spend a lot of their time actually getting food. Okay,
so the thing about hunter-gatherer existence, as you probably would have seen, is very gendered.
Yes.
And you say, do I want to send us all back to the kitchen? Of course, this is a loaded term because in small-scale society and in societies basically everywhere around the world, it is the women that do the cooking, unless you come to urbanized, modern industrial nations. Sure. And so the women are very much committed to that, and the men have options. That is the way the sort of food politics works. If the men want to go hunting, they'll go hunting. If they want to go off and look for a girlfriend in a neighboring camp, they'll do that.
They didn't do that, I hasten to add.
Okay, well,
but they did spend an awful lot of time smoking some substance in their pipes, I have to say. Thank you. Claude Fishler, you are a professor of sociology and anthropology in Paris. One thing that the Hadzabe also showed us in Tanzania is that food is more than just mere survival. It does hold insights into hierarchy and culture, in that particular society. And I noticed that the women did sit separately from the men, but it was also a very egalitarian society. The women, if the men didn't get catch any animal hunting, they would share everything they had equally, and then the fruit, the berries, and so on. So what role does food play in our lives in helping tell us something about the cultural, hierarchical, and values of a society?
Well, come to think of it, it's not just cultural, as you said, survival, etc. I would say we are what we eat, quite literally, biologically speaking, because everything we put in our bodies is not just burned, as it were, as energy. It's also the building blocks of our very substance, for a part. So we are what we eat. And we are what we eat in an imaginary, symbolic, magical sense, in the sense that there is this heuristic, this way of thinking that is apparently universal, that what you eat makes you feel or look like what you're eating. That is, what you eat is sort of changes you from the inside. I mean, you just have to look at advertising, commercials about foods. They use that all the time. I remember an old commercial in France about Evian water, mineral water. It said something like, Evian gives you what the mountain gave it. So what in the world does the mountain give the water? It's probably something, I don't know, purity of the water that flows from the glaciers, or is it something that closer to heavens, something like that. But anyway, you are what you eat in this very sense. So what is really crucial, and that's also a universal, is that people want to know what they're eating. It's been said in so many words this morning, very seriously. I mean, we want to know what we eat, because if we are what we eat, we want to know what we eat. If we don't know what we eat, we don't know what we are. I mean, and we feel threatened, and we are anxious for us, for our relative that we're responsible for, that sort of thing. So this is the common problem, I mean, in the West now, in the developed world, I don't like to talk about the West because the so-called Western countries are very different from each other, most of them. And the common problem is that there's a growing challenge associated with the processing of our food, the retail system, the specialization of the global ecosystems instead of the diversified local ecosystems, and people don't know where their food comes from. And they're concerned about that. They don't know what's in there. You can put labeling on it. It doesn't change much. Actually, it increases anxiety, if anything. And that's the situation.
We will come to We Are What We Eat in a moment when I speak to Elizabeth. But in terms of how food helps, it is a kind of vehicle for manifestations of cultures, values, its hierarchy. I said the Hadzabe had a very egalitarian approach to the way they ate. I mean, not all societies or communities are necessarily egalitarian, and does therefore food play a role in helping us see that? Is that illustrative of that?
Well, I think there is something novel too, and that is a part of the world has turned what was collective into something that is essentially individual. And that part of the world is probably very Western. I think it's mostly in the US and the English-speaking world in general. We ran studies, qualitative, quantitative, I mean questionnaires, interviews, focus groups for years, and we came up with the observation that when you ask people in places like France, Italy, Spain to a certain extent, parts of Switzerland, what is eating well, they will typically at one point tell you something about collective experience of eating. That is a meal that develops in a normal, codified way is a thing that makes the experience of food fine and normal and everything. And then you have another view of the world. So it turns out that it's mostly Catholic countries, historically Catholic countries, that reason as if the meal was the center of the food experience, and the meal functions as a ritual and almost a communion. Okay, so you share into the food as if it was the Eucharist, you know, the blood and the flesh of Christ. So you're not going to ask questions about whether the flesh of Christ has gluten or not. I mean, you know, you're not going to be fussy.
I think I'm still with you.
You see what I mean?
Okay.
Now, what about the Protestant, historically Protestant? I mean, it has nothing to do with actual religious practice, but it's just something that is inscribed in culture, as Max Weber saw it. Okay. So the Protestants have a different view. They think it's all about individuals meeting. The meal is just a meeting of two or several individual free wills. So it's a contract, it's not a communion. It's a contract, so it's all about negotiating it. So I'll eat this and you'll eat that, and I don't eat this and you don't eat that, and that's that.
But I have to say, just very quickly before I come to Elizabeth, the French are masters, aren't they, at using food as kind of a way of expressing their cultural superiority when it comes to the wonderful banquets that you have at the Élysée Palace. I'm sure you've been to one or two where they put their best foot forward. We know about food, but anyway, I'll give you a right to reply in a moment.
In a moment, okay.
In a moment, you can think about that one. Professor Elizabeth Blackburn.
Okay, I can ponder this.
Professor Blackburn, in 2009, you were the Nobel Prize winner for Medicine Physiology Prize for your pioneering work on telomeres, which are the kind of shoelaces that tie up chromosomes, if I could say it that way. And you have got a huge interest in you know, how cells stay healthy and what we can do to promote the health of our cells and what we can do to avoid deterioration and harmful materials. So when we're talking about the role of food in our lives, the role of food is key, isn't it, to maintaining good health and so on. Does your scientific background give us any tips on what we should eat for breakfast, lunch and dinner?
Funny you should say tips.
I'm staying close to you.
Oh, microphone, please. Yeah. Working now? Anybody up the back hear me? Are you awake? So tips, telomeres are the tips of chromosomes, so nice, yes. So I think it takes us back to something really quite profound about about food, which is, we need it to sustain us, clearly, but we also need it to get to full development, and recommended daily intakes or weekly intakes.
I think mine is, I don't know, maybe
Should we swap microphones?
I think that would be a rather laborious process. It's been kind of stuck to my neck.
A lot of hair, right?
Yes.
Right. So,
is it coming back?
Can I be heard? Yes. What we know very little about is...
If I may, yeah.
So we do know that having what is generally regarded as, fairly fruit and fiber and vegetable rich and, not too much highly processed sugary foods, that's associated with better maintenance of telomeres, and that in turn, in adult populations, over and over again is associated with, if your telomeres are better maintained throughout the decades of now adult life, then your risks, and we're talking statistical risks, of things like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, now lung diseases, now even Alzheimer's, started to be related to this in ways where there's real causality in there. There's a contribution. So it matters. So what's interesting is that we've got these generalizations. We know in general what sorts of foods are better. But what's fascinating to me is that how very little we understand about what's actually best for us as we go through all our life course. Is the food that you eat from, 70 to 90 or something really the food that is optimal for when you're in your 20s and 30s, or optimal for when you're in your 40s, 50s, and 60s? It's completely unknown. So to me, I think what we should aspire to is say, well, food is such a central part of our lives. We should aspire to saying, let's actually try and find this out. And with the sorts of technologies and ways you can measure things, this is not crazy anymore.
Right, it's interesting.
Understand. So then we can talk about the details around that. But I think we have a pretty basic question that we don't know. We're eating stuff, but we don't even know if it's really that good, and that's the confusion that we talked about, the recommendations that confuse us all.
Right, because there was an article which cited you as saying that you thought there was mileage in this argument, which is that a vegan diet is one that does promote a healthy lifestyle, and therefore...
Right.
Yeah.
That's okay, but I wouldn't be nearly so... That's where there's some data, right, which are pretty consistent. But that, to me, is not prescriptive, saying you have to be vegan, because you could probably very well intersperse that with all sorts of things. Believe me, I ate Kobe beef for the first time in my life a few weeks ago, and I thought that was pretty delicious, but I'm not going to make a life habit of it. So I think you can really mix it up quite a lot.
I had lunch with you. Your secrets are safe with me.
So I think it's trends of what you eat rather than, fussing over the individual bits of it. I think it's going to be the more helpful.
I wonder if you've looked at this year's Nobel Prize winner for medicine or physiology, Professor Yoshinori Osumi, because he won his prize for developing our knowledge of autophagy, which is kind of when the body eats itself. It comes from the Greek, doesn't it?
Which is a good thing to do, by the way.
Well, this is what I was going to ask you. We've known about autophagy for the last 50 years or so, but he really helped us understand the genes which, explain it. And so it's the way cells
recycle
get rid of harmful material as well as recycle the good.
Yes.
And it was put to him that as people got older, some kind of calorie reduction in what they eat would help promote healthy cells one way or another. And I met him and I asked him whether, because there were reports that he himself practiced this kind of, not starvation diet, but certainly kept his calorie intake low for at least part of the week, and whether this would promote better health. And he said it's been proven in mice, but not in humans.
Oh, I can tell you the story. It's marvellous, and it's actually very interesting.
As long as it's not too long, because I've got to get to Eduardo, but go on.
Eat your food within a 12-hour period, and make sure there's about a 12-hour space between, say, evening food and breakfast. And there's really lovely data in mice, cognitive, behavior, and all sorts of other health measures much better, and beginning data in humans. So it's have a nice big gap between dinner and breakfast.
You see, you're getting all these health tips.
Similar calories.
From a Nobel scientist laureate.
Based on, there's a guy at the Salk Institute who found this beautifully in mice. And so now we think that there's data coming out in humans.
You know, I have to say very quickly, all my life I've never eaten breakfast. It is something
This is why you look in such good shape, Zeinab, because it's clearly working.
Thank you so much.
You're living evidence.
So I'm a lifelong experiment, I can tell you. I won't say how old I am.
We call it longitudinal, but it's n equals 1, so we need more.
Really?
We need more of you. Right?
Yeah, ever since I was an infant, I've never eaten breakfast. Ask me my age now. I'm like that woman who was asked how old she was. She said she's approaching 50, but wouldn't say from which direction. So ça c'est moi. But I have never eaten breakfast, so I will regularly go for 10 or 12 hours without eating. And yeah, so anyway, thank you. There we are. So Eduardo Nilson, hello to you. So you are the Vice Coordinator for Food and Nutrition at the Brazilian Ministry of Health, and you're an expert in salt reduction. I said I had lunch with you as well, but your secret is also safe with me. Now, when we're talking about the role of food in our lives, there's also, we talked a bit about the cultural aspect. I wonder if you just touch on that in terms of Brazilians, because there you are, this wonderful mix, you know, 180 million people, what are you? Whatever.
200 million.
200 million, whatever, yes. So, and you're this wonderful mix of European and indigenous and African and so on. So, you know, the role of food there helps tell us the kind of history of Brazil.
Yeah, it truly does. And it's, firstly, I will approach a concern that we have. Unfortunately, we, as all ministers of health around the world, we work a lot with disease, and that's not what it should be. And we see all the relation between the food habits that are changing, replacing the traditional foods for the industrialized, ultra-processed foods, and that's directly correlated to chronic disease, to increasing obesity, and also to not having enough micronutrients in the diet. It's all associated because it's a whole food pattern going on. But on the other hand, we do have all of this heritage, all the culture behind it, and Brazil is a very vast country and has had immigration and also the indigenous populations mixing together, and that's actually built many different food cultures in the country. And the most interesting part is that we found that each one of them in its uniqueness is healthy, because it was built that as the foods have their own history of being a non-random group of nutrients. We do have the meals having the same meaning. So they evolve culturally and sociologically through time, and that brings us to a whole mixing pot, which is Brazil, but with all the differences. And we see that each region has different foods, and actually you can build very healthy diets in each one of them. And that's why actually how our food guidelines were built, because we were able to see in each region what were healthy foods people were eating. So it's very feasible.
So, right, so we're talking to Elizabeth here about the link between food and health. So you are concerned now in Brazil because as there's growing affluence amongst some communities in the country, they're shifting from those traditional foods to more of a Western diet, and that's really increasing the level of communicable diseases, diabetes, obesity, I think you said, has tripled in the last 20 years. Imagine, tripled in the last 20 years in Brazil because of this shift in diets. So I wonder if you could just tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, it's something that we should address, actually, because the rice and beans, vegetables, and meat, which are a staple food in Brazil, it has the mix in these different cultures, but it actually is so protective to the heart, as is the Mediterranean diet. There are studies going on in Brazil that prove that. It's very important to see that you don't have to switch yourself to a different context. You have the right food, so to say, the healthier foods in your own context. And that helps us to actually address the people to show that what they can do is part of their real lives and part of the foods they access, but also as a policymaker, we had to, health only actually receive the outcomes from all in terms of the diseases and everything, but if we want to promote health, we want to promote healthy diets, we have to influence the other policies as well, from production to distribution to income, because it's all together. People have to have access to food, but healthy food as well.
Sure. I mean, one thing that I suppose you're best placed to raise on this panel, because you're the only person who represents a country that's not a developed country, I suppose, still defined as a developing country, is the role of food, the role that food plays in development. And of course, in Brazil, you've been pioneers in the what's known as the conditional cash transfers, the Familia Bolsa, you call it in, or Bolsa Familia in Brazil, whereby poorer families, families with below average income, are given cash by the government. And it's generally given to the women who head the households, and they use it predominantly to buy food. And that, of course, improves their family's well-being. So food does play a role in health indicators, but also that contributes into a country's development.
Yeah, it sure does. I think that Brazil has tackled malnutrition, both wasting and stunting in children. And in a decade, we have reduced to half what we had in stunting. It's something that was thought to be done in a generation, but it has to do with all the context, working with social policies, but including the income, but income with education, with the whole sanitation and all the environment going on. So people actually do purchase foods because that's the main priority to the families. And it's something very interesting that we found in analyzing some data, is that we're not only protecting the children from stunting and wasting, but we're also protecting them from overweight by adding the purchase of food, local foods being produced there, and also the education, because the education is behind everything in terms of childcare and having the best choices for them too.
Shut up. Yeah, go back here. You just said something very interesting there, which is local producers, because that's another aspect of this conversation, which is local food producers often need some kind of help, so that it's not just the big food corporations that dominate the market and so on. So that is also an important aspect of what you've done there.
Yes, it is, and it's something that we've actually been working on. Thinking about obesity is the same way, improving the food markets at the local level, but also what we can do as governments from the federal, state, or municipal levels, that we can have procurement policies, for example, as we have in schools. There's something very important that you have.
Let's see if mine's working.
Okay.
Yeah, it's come back. There you go. Maybe we just sit very still, don't move.
We have created a rule that not only for the school feeding program, which is all around the country, and it actually attends millions of school-age children in Brazil. We have the nutrition criteria, of course, that privileges most natural foods, but it's something very important at the local level. The procurement policy requires that at least 30% of the foods must be bought from family agriculture, smallholders, and local. Okay, I'll stay them back. And they've actually produced the foods that are produced locally, but also that accepted by the culture. That's something that belongs to that whole community. Sure. And so it gives all the sense of mixing it all together and bringing education with food and everything.
Right. Well, there you are, audience. Have I got microphones in the audience for people to put points to? Microphones, if you could. There's a young man there. I see another show of hands. So, and the two there. Because what makes us human is cooking food, and that helped us in our development. We also share food, actually, because primates don't share food, do they? They just snatch it.
Not like we do. Exactly.
Like my children, like my kids do.
Yeah.
My 4 children don't ever share. They just grab the food. So we've heard about food and, how it defines us as being human beings. We've heard about food as a kind of cultural, social, anthropological force, what it tells us about, and food and the links between food, nutrition, and health, and then a bit of that as well as food is a critical factor in development. So please let's get, if you'd be so kind as to stand, young man, that would be great. Introduce yourself and your organization if relevant.
Hello, my name is Martin Norby, and I'm doing research about how agriculture is influencing the global economy. And you talked a bit about the vegan diet and the health and how it influences the health. And there is something called the IGF gene, which longer the life of a cell by twice. So my question for you is, and to trigger that gene, you can eat a vegan diet. So my question is, why do people choose to eat things that are bad for them, and what can we do to help people make good choices?
All right, thank you. We'll keep that question in mind. We'll come to it. We need a psychologist on the panel, don't we? But I think that's going to be one for you, Claude. Thank you. We'll keep that. Pass the microphone to the other person who wanted to ask a question. Yeah, are there two microphones? Yep. Thank you. If you could give unless you want to ask a question, I would recommend you relinquish it to, who wanted to ask a question? I know you've got one. Who else? Anybody else? Okay, there's one at the back there, but it's okay, we'll get that one to you. Go ahead.
Hello, I'm Ivana, master's student in strategic communications. And I wanted to ask you, if I'm not wrong, I know so far Brazil is the only country in Latin America that have implemented a sustainable eating guide. Has that been able to be implemented successfully in a country that still have so many challenges and people may have still other priorities than eating healthy? Maybe passed from the eating healthy to eating sustainable? And how has that been done?
Thank you. Just pass the microphone behind you, if you'd be so kind, young lady. Thank you. And then we'll come to the panel. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Divya Rajgopal.
It's okay, I remember.
I'm a journalist from India. My question is for the sociologists there. The whole talk about healthy eating and, sustainable eating, do you fear that the old cultural aspect of food probably might get lost because of this, the fad that we're seeing about, what we're here for? Is that something that you worry about?
Right, so do the latest eating fads, are they going to, what did you say?
No, the stress on eating healthy food, is that going to take away the cultural aspects of what we've been eating for the many, many years ago?
What do you eat then that's unhealthy but culturally sound?
Sorry?
What do you eat that's culturally sound but is unhealthy?
Well,
donuts?
Many things. I mean, Indian food is probably...
Indian food?
It's some might say that it's not healthy, too much rice. But there is so much good things that's sort of made out of, those rice. A lot of oil, a lot of spices, which probably, I think, is not... we would not call it healthy in today's world.
Oh, I don't know. I love a curry. Carry on eating it. It's fine. If I may be so bold, panelists, to answer that one. So, let's go to you then, Eduardo. How sustainable this sustainable, healthy diet that's been introduced in Brazil, has it really been implemented properly?
It's actually, it's a dietary guideline, which is, it's supposed to be sustainable, healthy, and socially just. So we try to get all of these together. It's not only about the environment, but I think that a healthy diet should be based on the production, which should be sustainable, but also produce social justice on the way. That's why we acknowledge so much the role of local producers and the local circuits and how we could get all of these foods together. So it's actually a challenge to do that because, first of all, you will be facing the big industry all around because it's mainstream in all places. But on the other hand, we do have a lot of scientific evidence, so we're working on that through working in producing healthy settings and subsidizing regulation, which is needed in some cases, both to make an environment that provides better access to healthy foods, but also to avoid unhealthy choices. And informating the population, because it has to go in all levels, so people are informed. And it's actually something that, addressing the first question, if I could.
Yeah, I'll come back to that one to you. You can answer it, but I'll just come to Claude maybe. Do you want to answer why people eat the wrong thing, the first question from the young man?
No, I don't know.
You don't know?
Do they really?
Do they?
Do they really? I mean, you know, my point is, I mean, societies of the past that were eating the wrong thing probably aren't here anymore. And on the other hand, we see more adaptation than the opposite. We see that Mexicans cook their tortilla maize dough in water that is with ashes, and it makes the lysine and the tryptophan, the amino acids in the maize, bioavailable. Okay, when you ask them why they do it, what do they say? They say, I don't know, we've always done it this way. Or they say, well, it tastes better, or something like that, which is disputable. So in other words, but that's not the point.
The ash is bad for you, is that the point?
No, it's good for you. It makes the maize.
Yeah. But he asked why people eat the bad. Why do people continue to eat bad things?
But I think that the bad things are nowadays we decide that some things are bad and we can probably identify them. But the truth is that our life expectancy has increased, for instance, in Western Europe, and something like 20 years since 1936. So if it was that bad, you know, I heard last year for the first time they said that the life expectancy in France had been decreasing. So I looked up the data, and I have a former student who's into these things, and it turns out that it's about people over 65 because they weren't doing their flu shots.
Ah, I see. Nothing to do with the food.
Because there's the anti-vaccine movement or that sort of thing.
Sure. Okay. Elizabeth, do you want to answer? Yeah. Why do people eat the wrong things?
Well, very specifically, if we say wrong things include very high sugar content, refined sugar content, it turns out, and sometimes high fat, there's a pretty adaptive response to stress, which is that. So I'll tell you what happens in the lab, and we didn't do this work, but I'll just tell you, if you stress rats very mildly, you're not being really mean to them, but you just do it day after day after day, you make them sort of sit in a little area for a while and not run around and so on, and they get very stressed out, and then you give them equal access to either really junk, high-fat, high-sugar food or just regular rat chow, then what they do is the stressed ones, as opposed to the unstressed ones, they go for that high-sugar, high-fat, instant energy food. And they don't eat that many more calories, it's about the same. But that's a very adaptive response. If you're in stress, you need to have a response to be able to respond quickly. So it's built into our physiology. And then it starts setting up reward centers in the brain too, these high sugar things too. So there's physiology there. And if we understand it, we get away from the blame game. We have to say we recognize it, and then we figure out ways in which one can cope with this.
Interesting. I have a very sweet tooth. Not my fault. So, Richard Wrangham, do primates like sweet things? Chimps, gorillas, our closest relatives?
Yeah. I mean, the reason that we like all these bad things is that we haven't had the opportunity to have them in the past. But all primates absolutely adore sugar, and many of them really like fat. So the reason that we like them so much, of course, is that there were never enough of them in the past. All wild animals, in my experience, are hungry all the time. Humans are in a completely new world of being able to satisfy their food desires on a regular basis. So the solution, of course, is not to make these things so available. Whether or not that's a politically acceptable solution is a different matter.
Sugar tax.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Please don't take away our sugar. Eduardo, you wanted to come in briefly. Go on, Claude. Yes, sorry, go on.
What I said is not, it's not enough. It may sound wrong. I mean, when people eat things that are bad for them, it's basically that they cannot afford much else. And I'll give you a very brief example of what I mean. I had access to a subsample of an American sample of what they call working poor. Usually, often single women, and this is in the city of Columbus, Ohio. Single women with children, they're juggling 3 or 4 different jobs. They don't own a car in a city where public transportation isn't exactly comfortable and common. So what happens? They come home in the evening. They're not going to do extensive shopping. They're going to go for the stuff that has the most calories for the least dollars, that will be enjoyable for the children that are going to sit in front of the TV. And it will come in bags, and they won't have to cook, and the kids will be quiet.
Interesting. So, we had that question from the young lady from India. Your final thoughts, Elizabeth and gentlemen, on that issue, and just incorporate your parting shots. So, you know, if things are indigenous to a culture, the food has been built up as a tradition over many centuries, and yet some people might say it's a little bit harmful because it's high in saturated fats or cooked in oil or deep fried or whatever. There is a role that food plays in our lives, which is we mustn't lose sight of the fact that it is enjoyable, and that you want to hang on to things which your grandparents and forefathers and foremothers have eaten. Isn't that right? Your final thought, Eduardo?
No, that's very true. I think the key that we found in, based on our experience, not only Brazil, but I can speak actually for most Latin American countries, is that we need to diversify the diets. That's something that is in the very root of addressing all of, from obesity to malnutrition to even micronutrient deficiencies, because all cultures have built this over time, both in terms of the foods they eat, the meals they eat, and so it's all part of the same. And that actually addresses what was spoken about, the stress of eating healthy, that we have to, it's something you don't have to overthink, actually. Right. But you have to fight, so to say, against the system, because there's a lot of advertising on bad food, and people, so people need information. They need to know about the costs, what is the supply system of food, and we must have different pictures. And not in America, it's actually cheaper to have a healthy diet than in other countries. So you have to work with that. And
yeah. If you had your last meal, what would your last meal be?
Oh. I really like fruits and vegetables.
Fruits and veg, oh my God.
With spices.
All right, you, Claude, final point. We don't want to take the joy out of food. And what's your final meal?
Thank you so much for bringing this up, because
but in like 1 minute.
I wanted to make that statement. That we've heard so much about health and so much about the world and the environment, and so little about joy and pleasure out of eating. And what makes our life, part of what makes our life enjoyable is the food we eat and share and enjoy. And taste
you
is a word.
You deserve to be French.
No, well, thank you. Sometimes I think of myself as a professional French, you know?
Yeah. In this regard, food all the way, What's your final favorite meal, your final dish?
My favorite dish? I mean, it's you know, it's always, lately, food and gastronomy have been a lot about discovery, creativity and everything. And I find myself becoming more and more conservative and more along the Proust approach, you know, the memories from the back. So from my childhood, it was blanquette de veau.
You have to tell people what that is, something to do with
it's a very basic family dish in France that almost everybody will cite as their favorite dish.
We'll get the recipe afterwards. Elizabeth.
Lots of variety. Make sure there's plenty of plants in there. But my favorite meal, which I hope to die with, is the one from Arpège, which is 13 courses of tiny, tiny, tiny little bits of vegetarian-based things. Incredibly delicious and so joyful, and yet, it's the beauty of having wonderfully tasty food, like what we had at lunch.
That sounds nice.
These little things we had at lunch.
Can I come to?
Were lovely.
Richard
Come to my last meal.
Yes, I'll join you. Richard Wrangham. So, don't take the joy out of it. It's been there for years, and your final meal.
I might take the joy out of it. So, I mean, look, the last 15 years or so have been absolutely incredible in terms of raising the amount of food produced in the world by, I think it's 30% per individual for the world. And we are moving people out of poverty into increasingly good nutritional status in general. So, that is all incredibly exciting.
Yeah.
The big question in the future is how much can we go on increasing survival as opposed to, or having to focus on the issues of survival, as opposed to, on the other end altogether, focusing on sheer pleasure, on the development of new exotic ways to cook our food, prepare it through molecular gastronomy or whatever.
Which is also healthy.
Which is, can, of course, be designed to be healthy.
Okay, and your final meal?
Something really, really healthy, chocolate brownie with layers of cream.
Oh, yeah. I'll just finish I'll just finish where I started, which I have to say is when I was with the Hadzabe tribe, and I told you how they ate, there was not one overweight person, male, female, or child amongst them. They all had flat stomachs, regardless of what age they were, very lean and healthy looking. And when I said, don't you want to go and be part of modern Tanzanian society and have all that? I said, no, we prefer to live like this. And for the record, for me, it would be chicken satay and chocolate. Thank you all very much. Thank you.